Day by day our lives are turning, like a potter's wheel they spin. You are choosing your own maker. Choose your potter's wheel, my friend.
If you're joining us in the middle of this study, I hope you'll go back to the previous 2 videos for some foundational information. I'll give you a link right up here. We're talking about Jesus' prophecy of Matthew 24. Since the signs of Matthew 24 are predicted as coming upon this generation, as we saw last week, we need to determine what Jesus meant. Looking back at Matthew 23:36, the condemnation of Jesus in that text was to fall upon this generation. In his book, The Late Great Planet Earth, Hal Lindsey wrote that the doom in this prophecy would fall upon the same generation that crucified him. Well, Mr. Lindsey is right. That is exactly what Jesus meant in Matthew 23, and the original hearers would have understood that correctly. However, Hal Lindsey took a different position on that same phrase in Matthew 24:34. Mr. Lindsey says that the phrase "this generation" in Matthew 24 refers to the length of time it will take for the prophecy to be fulfilled. He writes, what generation? Obviously in context, the generation that would see the signs, chief among them the rebirth of Israel. A generation in the Bible is something like 40 years. If this is a correct deduction, then within 40 years or so of 1948, all these things could take place. He claims to rely on context, but he has not dealt with an important part of the context. That is the very first question asked by the disciples. Jesus is answering their question. Lindsey misrepresents the disciples as asking how long the process will take rather than when these things will be fulfilled. If you'll read Mr. Lindsey's quote again, the time for when these things should happen is a generation from when Israel would be reborn. He tells us that rebirth was fulfilled in 1948 and that a generation is 40 years in length. Simple arithmetic would give 1988 as the time for complete date of fulfillment when the Great Tribulation should begin. In other words, 1948 plus 40 years. We're now far beyond that date. This is what I've been telling you about these speculative interpretations that we hear all the time. They end up falling through and they prove to be erroneous. And yet people still crave someone speculating about the future. Problems interpreting Matthew 24 are not found in a difficult message given by Jesus. The problem is found in human additions and subtractions that change the meaning of his message. Ignore the question asked by the disciples, and it's easy to view the entire chapter as a prophecy of the rapture or the second coming. Add in the rebirth of Israel, and you inject a personal doctrine. There isn't even anything about the rebirth of Israel anywhere in Matthew 24. Who asked, and to whom will it apply? This generation. In Matthew 24, 5 through 15, Jesus gave a list of signs the disciples should and should not watch for, so they could be as certain as looking for fruit on a tree. He tells them that it will be within this generation. Remember, he said, this generation to them, not us. They wanted to know when, and Jesus told them in this generation. Since a generation is 40 years, and Jesus was saying this around AD 33, then it would have had to have been fulfilled by AD 73. In other words, AD 33 plus 40 years. In fact, it was fulfilled in AD 70, within the 40 years. That's when Jerusalem was completely destroyed by the Romans. That would put it within the generation at which Jesus was speaking. Why would I go looking for a future fulfillment when it was so clearly fulfilled in the lives of the generation living when Jesus spoke? Well, this seems to create a problem when we get to Matthew 24 and verse 29. How could we apply the heavenly signs in this text to the destruction of Jerusalem? And no, I'm not going to claim that stars literally fell and that the sun was blacked out in AD 70, but something happened in that generation, and I believe it was fulfilled in the time frame Jesus gave for it. Well, I'm afraid we're out of time again. Our next video will study these signs, and we'll consider with a Bible answer what is actually going on in this text. I hope you'll join me for that study.